When Maria Elena finally realized they were heading in the wrong direction, she politely pointed out the mistake. Silva apologized and claimed he had misunderstood her address, but instead of turning around, he continued driving away from the city. When she became more insistent, Silva's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The transformation was like watching a mask being removed to reveal something monstrous underneath. The kind, concerned taxi driver disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Silva told Maria Elena that she was going to do exactly what he said, and that if she tried to escape or call for help, he would make her suffering worse. What happened during the next several hours was too horrible for investigators to fully piece together. Maria Elena fought for her life with courage and determination, but she was no match for a man who had planned every detail of the attack. Silva didn't just kill his victim, he tortured her, drawing out her suffering for as long as possible. When he was finished, he left her body in a ravine outside Lima. The murder of Maria Elena Vasquez was initially dismissed by police as a robbery gone wrong, despite evidence suggesting something more sinister. The investigation was perfunctory, hampered by prejudice against victims from poor families and assumptions that violence against women was simply part of life in the city. But Silva was just getting started. The murder had given him a taste of ultimate power, and he craved more. 3 weeks later, he struck again with Carmen Rodriguez, a 22-year-old secretary working late. The pattern was becoming established, though no one yet recognized it as such. Other taxi drivers began to notice subtle changes in Silva's behavior. He seemed more confident and would sometimes make jokes about passengers that struck his colleagues as inappropriate. When news reports mentioned murders, Silva showed excessive interest in the details, asking questions that made others uncomfortable. The investigation that would eventually recognize the work of a serial killer began almost by accident. Detective Inspector Rosa Mendoza was reviewing cold cases in early 2000 when she noticed similarities between several unsolved murders of young women. All had last been seen getting into taxis, all were found in isolated areas outside Lima, and all showed signs of sexual assault and extreme violence. Mendoza was one of the few female detectives in the Lima police force, and she had fought hard to earn respect in a male-dominated profession. When she presented her analysis of the connected murders to her superiors, they were initially skeptical. The idea that a taxi driver might be systematically hunting passengers seemed almost impossible to believe. Working with a small team, Mendoza began mapping locations where victims had last been seen and where bodies were discovered. A clear pattern emerged. Pickup locations were in areas where legitimate taxi drivers worked, but dump sites were in isolated areas, suggesting intimate knowledge of the city's geography. The breakthrough came when investigators realized several witnesses had described the same taxi, a yellow sedan with distinctive damage to the rear bumper. The descriptions were vague, but consistent enough to suggest the same vehicle was involved in multiple murders. The investigation was hampered by the fact that many victims came from poor families with little faith in police. Some families had never reported their daughters missing, assuming authorities wouldn't care about young women from the slums. The capture of Julio Pérez Silva came through a combination of luck and the courage of a potential victim who refused to become another statistic. On August 23, 2001, Silva picked up Ana Lucia Torres, a 20-year-old nursing student returning home from work. Ana Lucia had grown up in one of Lima's toughest neighborhoods and had learned to be suspicious. When Silva began taking an unnecessarily long route and asking personal questions, she knew something was wrong. Unlike Silva's previous victims, Ana Lucia was prepared to fight. When Silva turned onto a dark road leading away from the city, Ana Lucia managed to spray him with pepper spray and kick out the taxi's rear window, creating enough noise to attract attention. Silva temporarily blinded and panicked, crashed into a roadside barrier. The search of Silva's vehicle revealed rope, knives and personal items belonging to several previous victims, jewelry and identification cards that Silva had kept as trophies. When confronted with this evidence, Silva's story began to fall apart. The confession that followed was chilling. Over several days, Silva calmly described murder after murder, providing details only the killer could know. He admitted to killing at least 23 young women, speaking about their deaths with the casual manner of someone describing daily routine. The trial of Julio Pérez Silva was one of Peru's most closely watched criminal proceedings. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, journalists, and public members who wanted to see the man who had terrorized their city. What they saw was an ordinary-looking middle-aged man who seemed more like a tired office worker than a serial killer. Silva's defense attempted to argue mental illness, but prosecution psychiatric experts testified that while he had psychological problems, he was not legally insane. His crimes showed too much planning and awareness of right and wrong for him to claim he didn't understand his actions. When Silva testified, he spoke in the same calm voice that had once convinced dozens of women to trust him. He showed no remorse, no understanding of the pain he had caused, giving rambling explanations about feeling powerful and fulfilling his destiny. The truth was simpler. He killed because he enjoyed it. The psychological evaluation revealed a mind completely devoid of normal human empathy. Dr. Patricia Morales found Silva capable of mimicking emotional responses, but feeling nothing genuine toward other human beings. He viewed his victims as objects that had served a purpose, no more significant than the tools he used to kill them. Silva spoke about his taxi with more affection than any human being, describing it as his partner in crime. He genuinely believed he had provided a service to society by removing what he saw as worthless individuals, showing complete inability to understand why his crimes caused public outrage. The case of Julio Pérez Silva forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, vulnerability, and the masks evil can wear. His victims were young women building better lives, students, employees, daughters who were loved and valued. They trusted Silva because they had to. In Lima, taxis were often the only safe way to travel at night. His actions created a climate of fear that changed how people lived. The investigation revealed serious flaws in protecting vulnerable members of society, as many victims came from poor families whose concerns were dismissed by authorities. Today, Silva remains in prison, an old man whose killing days are behind him. He continues to maintain his actions were justified. His story serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary facades, that those we trust with our safety can sometimes be our greatest threats. The women who died at Silva's hands will never fulfill their dreams or make their planned contributions to society. The devil's taxi driver may be behind bars, but his legacy lives on in the fear he created and lives he destroyed, standing as testament to the importance of vigilance and the terrible price we pay when we fail to protect those who trust us. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shocked the world and the minds behind them. The Julio Pérez Silva case, the devil's taxi driver. The yellow taxi pulled up to the curb on a rainy Thursday evening in Lima, Peru. To the young woman waiting at the bus stop, it looked like salvation, a warm, dry ride home after a long day at work. She had no way of knowing that stepping into that cab would be the last decision she would ever make. Behind the wheel sat a man who appeared to be just another hard-working taxi driver, but Julio Pérez Silva was something far more sinister. For 3 years, between 1998 and 2001, Silva terrorized the streets of Lima, using his taxi as a mobile hunting ground. His victims trusted him because he was a taxi driver, someone whose job it was to get people safely from one place to another. Instead, he used that trust to lure them to their deaths, earning him the nickname that would haunt Peru's collective memory, the Devil's Taxi Driver. Silva didn't look like a monster. He was an ordinary-looking man in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who had worked hard his entire life. He spoke politely to his passengers, knew the city streets like the back of his hand, and could make small talk about the weather or the latest football match. But behind his unremarkable exterior lurked a predator who had discovered that his profession gave him the perfect opportunity to hunt. His victims were mostly young women, students, workers, anyone who needed a ride and made the fatal mistake of getting into his cab. They thought they were going home to their families, to their studies, to their lives. Instead, they were driving toward an encounter with evil that would end in isolated areas outside the city, where their screams would go unheard and their bodies would be left for the elements. But what drove a seemingly ordinary taxi driver to become one of Peru's most notorious serial killers? The answer lies in a childhood marked by abandonment, poverty, and the gradual erosion of whatever humanity he might have once possessed. Julio Pérez Silva was born on March 8, 1955, in Villa El Salvador, one of Lima's most notorious shantytowns, where poverty and violence were woven into the fabric of daily existence. His father, Miguel Pérez, was a construction worker who struggled with alcoholism and a violent temper that made him feared throughout their neighborhood. When he wasn't working, Miguel could be found in local cantinas, drinking away what little money the family had and picking fights with anyone who looked at him wrong. Julio's mother, Carmen Silva, had married Miguel when she was barely 17, already pregnant and with few options in a society that offered little support to unmarried mothers. She worked as a seamstress when she could find work, but Miguel's drinking and violent outbursts made it difficult for her to maintain steady employment. The Silva household was a place where children learned to walk quietly, speak softly, and disappear when their father's mood turned dark. Julio was the middle child of 5, old enough to understand the danger, but too young to protect himself or his siblings from it. He watched his father beat his mother unconscious on multiple occasions and learned that the world was divided into predators and prey. When Julio was 9 years old, his father was killed in a construction accident. Rather than bringing relief to the family, Miguel's death only made their situation worse. Carmen was left to raise 5 children on her own with no steady income and no support from a government that barely acknowledged the existence of the shanty towns. Julio's childhood effectively ended the day his father died. At 9 years old, he became responsible for helping to support the family, working odd jobs around the neighborhood and learning to steal when honest work wasn't available. School became impossible under these circumstances, and by age 12, he had fallen far behind his classmates. The neighborhood where Julio grew up was a place where violence was commonplace, and children learned early that the strong survived by preying on the weak. He saw older boys extort money from younger ones, watched drug dealers recruit children as runners, and observed how those with power used it to dominate those without it. These lessons would shape his understanding of human relationships for the rest of his life. By the time he was 18, Julio had saved enough money to buy his first vehicle, an old, battered taxi that he purchased from a retiring driver. The car was in poor condition and needed constant repairs, but it represented freedom and opportunity in ways that nothing else in his life ever had. The first signs that Julio Pérez Silva was becoming something dangerous appeared in the mid-1990s. Other taxi drivers noticed that he often volunteered to work the late-night shifts that most of them avoided, claiming he needed the extra money. He seemed to know every back alley and isolated road in and around Lima, knowledge that went far beyond what was necessary for normal taxi work. Silva began developing what he privately called his hunting techniques. He learned to identify vulnerable passengers, women traveling alone, people who seemed lost or confused, anyone who appeared to have no one waiting for them at their destination. He became skilled at reading people, at sensing their fears and weaknesses. His taxi became a carefully designed trap. Silva kept it clean and well-maintained, knowing that passengers were more likely to trust a driver who took care of his vehicle. He installed extra locks on the doors that could only be operated from the driver's seat, ensuring that passengers couldn't escape once he decided to take them somewhere other than their requested destination. The transformation in Silva's personality during this time was subtle but noticeable to those who knew him well. He became more confident and talkative, often engaging other drivers in conversations about crime and violence that made them uncomfortable. He would read newspaper accounts of murders with obvious fascination, sometimes making comments that seemed to reveal more knowledge about such crimes than a normal person should possess. Several young women reported having uncomfortable encounters with a taxi driver who matched Silva's description during this period. They complained that he had taken longer routes than necessary, asked inappropriate personal questions, or made comments that seemed vaguely threatening. But these reports were scattered across different police stations and were never connected to form a recognizable pattern. Silva was learning to control his impulses, to wait for the perfect opportunity rather than acting on every violent urge. He was developing the patience and planning skills that would later make him such an effective killer, studying his potential victims like a predator studying prey. On February 18, 1998, Julio Pérez Silva crossed the line from potential predator to actual killer. His first victim was Maria Elena Vasquez, a 19-year-old university student who made the fatal mistake of getting into his taxi after missing the last bus home from her evening classes. Maria Elena was studying to become a teacher, driven by a desire to help children from poor families like her own. She was the first in her family to attend university, and her parents had made enormous sacrifices to pay for her education. That night, she had been studying late in the university library, working on a research paper about literacy programs in rural Peru. When Silva's taxi appeared outside the university gates, Maria Elena felt a wave of relief. She had been standing in the rain for nearly an hour, hoping that a taxi would come by. Silva seemed like a godsend, a polite professional driver who quoted her a reasonable fare and seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare. For the first 15 minutes of the ride, everything seemed normal. Silva took what appeared to be a direct route toward Maria Elena's neighborhood, and she began to relax. She had no way of knowing that Silva was actually driving toward an isolated area outside the city, using back roads that would ensure they encountered no other traffic.